started. And as you can see, our beautiful author, my guest tonight is Mimi Kwa. And I'll introduce myself first. I'm Zhang Mei, founder of WildChina, and this is our 87th event since COVID started. And some of you already know we do this monthly book club and we read a book somewhat related to China. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And on wildchina.com, you can always find more events coming up, or on our YouTube channel, you can see our past events. And for this September book club, we read House of Qua. As you can see in the WildChina account, that's the book cover, because I read the book on Kindle, so I don't quite have a copy of it here. And it's nonfiction, and this is very important because as you read along, it almost reads unreal until you keep reminding this is a true story of the Qua family. And it also later on follows with the birth and growth of our author, Mimi here. The story on the macro level spans an entire century, but it is told on a micro level at a very personal level. It is the lives of individuals, the emotions of every moment. So it is very real and very relatable. The book is hot off the press. And I know Mimi has been doing online book talks and not in person because of all these lockdowns in Melbourne. It just came out June this year. And so we're very excited to have you and tell us how you write it a bit later. And I will talk a little about Mimi. She's joining us, as I mentioned, from Melbourne. And you know, if any of you are from Australia, you would know she spent the past 20 plus years working as an Australian journalist, television newscaster on ABC and Channel 9, right? Or 9 channel.
Channel 9.
Channel 9, yeah. And maybe you recognize her from her acting in series on Foxtel, Stan, and ABC TV. And adding to all those previous accolades, she is now an author as well and launched the first book to much positive reviews. House of Qua is her first book. So Mimi, welcome. Thank you for taking the time.
So much. Oh, it's such a pleasure to be chatting to you. It's actually my morning here and your evening, or I guess various different time zones around the world. And it's such a thrill to be speaking about the book. And even though I'm in lockdown, and as many authors who've, debuted, novelists or memoirists who've launched their books in the last couple of years, as much as there is a negative side to it in that we can't get out and actually speak to people in person, as you mentioned before, technology is the silver lining to all of this. I mean, the number of people that I have been able to speak to thanks to Zoom calls has been extraordinary. So I cannot complain. I'm just excited to have the book out, and the feedback that I've been getting is just so incredible. Like, as an author, when you spend years, I spent 5 years writing this book, and when you spend that much time invested in creating something that you love and that you hope will touch the lives of others, when you spend that much time doing something, as everybody would appreciate, getting feedback from readers just means the absolute world. And that has really helped keep me going through this pandemic.
And talking about feedback, let me share one that I saw, and this will set the scene for us to launch into why you wrote the book, right? I'm quoting this from Instagram. I'm in Bali to clean up the affairs of my recently departed nephew at his own hands. I've been grasping for meaning, fighting the anxiety, and sometimes gasping for air. The stumbling upon your book, House of Qua, was a life-saving blessing. It reminded me of life's nature, the constant roller coaster between suffering and happiness, mixed with the occasional bliss of contentment. As a reader of 50 years, this is my first thank you. So you've helped more than you will ever know. And I believe this is a stranger who posted this to you, Mimi. Right? Congratulations. What an amazing note. And your response Yeah, and your response was it reminded you why you do what you do. So tell us why.
Well, first of all, May, that's the first time that anybody's read that back to me. This reader, who is a stranger to me, his name is Chris, he's no longer a stranger, contacted me literally 2 days ago. So this is very fresh. And this feedback was so moving and so emotional for me to receive, because I think, like many authors or many creatives, if you, and people in other fields, just knowing that you've touched the life and helped one person makes it all worthwhile. So I'm tearing up here because it was really such a momentous thing to receive this note, and just the humility that he wrote it with, just not even knowing whether it would reach me in the first place, and then speaking about, you know, his terrible ordeal and the horrible loss of his nephew, and what that must have done to him and to the family, and also just the tragedy in itself of the suffering that his nephew must have been enduring to do that. I mean, that all rolled into one was enough, but then to have him thank me for the words that I wrote on the page was, I don't know, that just blew my mind and has made every moment worthwhile putting my energy into that book.
Yeah, it's such, I couldn't help it. I was like, wow, so powerful.
Thank you for finding that and reading that back to me. I did get his permission to publish that on my Instagram because I was just so moved by it. And I thought, if anything, I wanted to share it with people, one, because it was so moving, but two, because I also wanted the people on my publishing team and the people who have contributed to the book, the characters in the book who are still alive, to know that this is actually reaching people and doing some good and is contributing to the greater good.
Right. Yes. So for some of our audience here, they may not have read the book. Would you read us a paragraph or two to set the scene for us?
Well, I'd love to. So first of all, I'll just say it's a 4-generational saga of the family of Quartz that hailed from the imperial compound in Beijing. And the book sort of traces the family history from my great-grandfather in the imperial compound in Beijing down to Swatow in southern China, and then across to Hong Kong, where my father was born, one of 32 brothers and sisters. And to a Chinese person, I love speaking to, I don't know the exact demographic of who we're speaking to today, but I assume that there are quite a few Chinese people or people of Chinese origin in the audience. And it's very funny because growing up, if I said to a Westerner, oh, my dad had 32 brothers and sisters, they would just, their jaws would drop and the conversation would stop and they just want to know more about it. But if I say it to a Chinese person, they're just like, oh, yeah, because every Chinese family, you know, has some sort of heritage in there with multiple wives and multiple siblings. So anyway, so that's just an aside. So the story traces the family history through 4 generations, from China to Hong Kong during the Second World War and the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, and then over to Australia, where I was born. And I will set the scene a little bit. It's written in 3 parts, in that there's Old Quartz, which is my great-grandfather and grandfather's life and families. And then there's New Quartz, which is my father's experience in Australia as a migrant to Australia. And then there's Now Quartz, which is me and my life. And it really looks at, and we can talk about this later, but, you know, the inherited culture that we benefit from, but that can also be challenging, and that comes with inherited trauma that I think a lot of families can relate to. So I'll read a little bit from Old Quartz. Splinters of bitterness embed in Nyuk's heart. The blood between her thighs has dried, and scorn and grief pour out of her, filling the room. Back in the house of Quartz, her emotions course over the floors, down corridors and stairs, across beds and tables. For days, despair laps at the concrete walls. Before long, though, Nguk is with child again. This time, as before, only one heartbeat is detected, and she hopes that this time there really is only one baby. Her grit restored, she lights a cigarette and settles in for gestation, even managing a smile that her purpose in life has not ended. She slaps a maid and yells for supper, just like her old self again. A sigh of relief can be heard in rafters and rugs, bone china and ivory, crystal and lace. Third wife is back, mahogany chairs and Persian tapestries cry. However, Nguk latches on to bottomless dissatisfaction, constant complaining and endless criticism, addictive like the cigarettes she is seldom seen without. Her madness deepens as the choir children watch on. And I'll just go to another little section from this. This is going back in time. I meant to read this bit first, but I think that's okay. Little teasers.
Yes.
Lotus Flower, who did not come down in the last rainfall, realizes that Happy Shadow, having also been exiled from her family to endure a life of broken feet and broken dreams, may be prone to her own ideas. And she is right. With no doubt of her worthiness of first place in the heart of her husband and in his household, Happy Shadow takes to the town with her own campaign. Why does her husband need a second wife if the first is so good? She whispers to a fishmonger as she collects her order. Would you not rather look upon me than her? Happy Shadow asks in a tea shop as she reaches to select Yinkham's leaves of choice, seductively revealing a slim ankle as she gently sweeps her cape aside. The village does love gossip. It's true, second wife is younger and prettier than first wife. Perhaps she's also a stronger type than first wife. Stories spread like silken sheets on a freshly made bed, and loyalties shift like bitter beans in a bowl of fragrant rice. There you go. That's just a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, these are the teasers, but from that period, that imperial sort of old China, the story carries on through World War II and to your current life, right? It's quite a sweeping scope. Now, I want to ask you, every author spends quite a bit of time looking at the cover of the book. Why did you choose this book? What did the cover of the book what did you want the cover of the book to communicate to anyone looking at it?
So the story, we haven't mentioned yet that and you did try to ask me about it, but went off on a tangent. The premise for the story and the reason that I wrote the book in the first place is that my father sued me in the Supreme Court. So in Australia, the Supreme Court is the second highest court that you can go to, but the High Court or the Federal Court being the top court, and then the Supreme Court is just under that. So what I wanted to convey with the book cover is and I use the metaphor of dragon and tiger throughout the book, because my father is quite clearly the dragon and I'm the tiger. And I really wanted to show through the colours of the cover some sort of contemporary feel about the book, because I didn't want people to feel that it was a stale or dry, just historical memoir, just, facts all lined up. I wanted it to have the feeling of a novel. And as you can tell from the little reading that I've just done, it reads like a novel and it reads like fiction, and it hopefully sweeps you away to have this, wild adventure through the eyes of myself, and experiencing the choir journey. But I want that sort of fictional aspect of it to come across from the cover. But we sort of say, my publisher said, well, we need to make sure that people know that it's true. And so it does say on the cover, an epic true story spanning 4 generations. I mean, my Andy Warren, who's the designer who designed the cover, and the team at HarperCollins who came up with the final design, was sort of inspired from my initial concept of the dragon and the tiger and this sort of ongoing intergenerational battle between the dragon and the tiger, which the dragon and the tiger are me and my dad, but it could be, you know, any female or any male in that sort of long line of Kwa. And I'm sure that many people in many Chinese families can relate to that.
Absolutely. And in your book, two characters stood out. I'm sure all of the readers would find the same. We're not going to tell you the whole story, but there's Aunty Theresa and your father, Francis. They both played such like major roles in your life. Who inspired you more to write the book, or together, like 5 years ago, what was on your mind that you decided this was a venture you would get on?
Well, it was definitely my dad, because when he sued me in court, I mean, it was a combination. So the reason that my father sued me was over the estate of my late Aunty Theresa. So my Aunty Theresa was just this incredibly successful international woman who was so instrumental in my upbringing, in that she was just a saint. You know, she befriended princes and paupers literally, and she was very spiritual in her own way. And I didn't really see that at the time. Well, I saw it, but I didn't recognize it or have the language around it that I do now. But she was a very spiritual person. She was the world's first Chinese air hostess for British Airways. Well, it was BOAC at the time, and it's now British Airways. And she literally met nobility. You know, she met monarchs and prime ministers and their wives, and she was friends with barons and baronesses, and was bequeathed some property and incredible gifts in the deceased estates of some of these people. And when she died, she had a number of wills across 3 different countries, including Australia. So she had one will in Hong Kong, one in the Philippines, and one in Australia. And she left me in charge. And so, in charge for the most part. And my dad couldn't stand that. And so it wasn't really about, essentially on the surface, it looked as though it was about money and it was about property and it was about valuables. But really it was about control and it was about power. And that drove me, first of all, it sent me grey overnight when my dad sued me in court. And then after I had a bit of space for a bit of introspection and reflection on what was happening, I saw it from that macro level of family, of patriarchy, of misogynism, of history, of culture, of tradition. And I realised that my father wasn't just acting independently, he was acting as a result of his culture. He was acting as a result of, you know, what he thought the man's role in a Chinese family as the patriarch was. And so it really helped me. It was almost like a therapy to go back in time and look at how my father must have been raised, how his father was raised, how my great-grandfather kept his household. And I looked at those male stories, but in that, of course, were the integral and important female stories. And something that comes up from that in terms of patriarchy and misogyny throughout history is this idea, or this fact. I was provided with a family tree from a second cousin, Matthew Kwa, that basically shows that my great-grandfather's wives, he had multiple wives, were only recorded on the family tree if they had born him a boy. So there's wife number 1, number 2, and then it skips to wife number 4, and then it skips to wife number 7, along those lines, where there are wife numbers that are completely left out of this family tree because they didn't have a boy. So there are all of these stories that are, of course, these women's stories, as we know, throughout history across all cultures, that are just lost forever. So I just did my best with this story, which, coming back to your question, was inspired by my father and his behaviour towards me around the court case, but largely inspired by my auntie and her influence on me to sort of see the bigger picture, to forgive, to have compassion, and to show gratitude.
Yeah, yeah. Just a process point. If anyone has questions about what we're discussing, or before you read the book or after you read the book, please put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We'll get to them as much as possible. But before we see that, I want to explore a little bit more of the social context that your stories talked about, right? One of which was you described the harrowing experience your family had in Hong Kong, the Quartz family had in Hong Kong through World War II. And you talked about the difficult story of your grandma being a collaborator, right? And I know in China as well as in Europe, there was a lot of retribution after the war. Was there any going on in Hong Kong? Was it difficult? I think the story, we went to Australia soon after that, right? So what happened to your grandmother?
Well, I think because of I guess the Hong Kong situation is very unique in that the British came back in to reoccupy in a peaceful occupation, of course, of Hong Kong, and they didn't. There wasn't any retribution, as far as I know, against my family. I think that it was recognised that people did what they needed to do, and I think that in my family's case, it seems as though in collaborating, my auntie, in fact, with her translation for the Japanese and the British, she was actually able to help some of the British people who had been incarcerated by the Japanese. So it was sort of a double-edged sword, I suppose. It wasn't a case of just, if you can't beat them, join them. I think it was a case of, okay, we are just trying to survive day to day here. I mean, there are episodes in the book and of course in the true family story where they didn't have anything to eat. I mean, this is the plight of a lot of Hong Kong people during the Japanese occupation. I mean, this was rations. This was serious wartime lockdown for 3 years and 8 months, and not only being locked down and just random bayoneting going on in the streets against civilians, local Hong Kong people. Hong Kong was being bombed by the Allies to try to rid Hong Kong of the invaders. So there was also friendly fire, which was a risk to their lives too. So they were getting it from all angles, and it just must have been a horrific situation to live in, and just that state of anxiety that would have infiltrated the bloodlines of all of the families who were in Hong Kong at the time. That sort of stuff, that kind of grief and that sort of horror doesn't just leave you once it's over. I mean, that's something that people live with, that people wake up in cold sweats in the middle of the night being haunted by. And I think it's these sorts of stories that, unless we tell these stories and we talk about these stories and we recognize that inherited trauma is a thing, unless we do that, then that's just going to continue. So I think part of writing the book for me as well, being first generation Australian Chinese, being the mix that I am, a lot of that was breaking the cycle. It was about breaking the cycle for me, and breaking the cycle of dysfunction, breaking the cycle of trauma, and it was about giving back, I think, to my family and to particularly my children who it's grown up themes in the book, of course, and so my children haven't read it yet. I've got 4 children. And they are aged between 10, and my eldest just turned 18, so I actually have an adult child, so he would be old enough to read it. But I have written it and dedicated it to my children because it is about breaking the cycle. And when you read my book, for those people who haven't read it already, you understand that there's a lot in there, from the ancient, and well, not so ancient, because China's idea, or Chinese people's idea of ancient, goes back thousands of years, not just 100 or so years, but going back in history to my great grandfather and his concubines and wives and my ancestors in China. There's a lot of ground covered to where I am now, and where I'm sitting right here now speaking to you today with 4 fully functional, I hope, well-adjusted, well-balanced kids who are just enjoying life and are so, you know, blessed and lucky.
Yeah, indeed. You know, I didn't tell you earlier, but I also have mixed children. So some of your writing about you growing up in Australia was particularly interesting to me. One of the things that struck me, I'll quote in the book, you said at grandparents' house, it was like, keep your shoes on, you must eat 3 big meals a day and don't leave any food on your plate. Well, dad's house, you were shuttling back and forth, and dad's house rules were the opposite. Take off your shoes at the door and eat when you feel like it, and put the leftovers in the stew. This kind of like, you know, changing rules. And also, not to mention your life in Australia versus going back to Hong Kong, the kind of, you know, differences you were constantly navigating. What do you think, what impact does that have on you? And yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question, and I get to mention here that I actually interviewed, because I'm a journalist, for a discussion recently. I interviewed John Cleese, as in, you know, the John Cleese, and he was talking about a similar thing with his childhood, that he was moved around a lot. They lived in 8 different houses over 8 years, and it struck me that with my experience being between houses and flying between countries, that not only, you know, because I thought, wow, I had to go through challenges and so I had to become creative. But John Cleese has actually done some research around this for his own book, which is called Creativity, that I was talking to him about. And his research actually turned up that children who do have a lot of dysfunction in their family, or do move around a lot, because those children are forced to adapt, and those children are forced to sort of navigate unusual circumstances or different unfamiliar circumstances on almost a, you know, weekly, daily, monthly, whatever basis, because they're having to acclimatise to different environments more frequently than, say, a child that grows up in a more stable environment. Those children who are constantly having to, you know, juggle different experiences grow up more creative. So that was so interesting to me, because I thought, wow, okay. And in answer to your question, I think that is the impact that it had on me, in that it made me see the world differently, or maybe different to most people that I knew in my, you know, cohort, in my school circles. And as a result, it turned me into the creative that I am. So I think, at the time, of course, it was challenging, and the impact that it had was, you know, sadness, trauma, loneliness, all sorts of things. But I think in the long run, it's actually been so positive.
Yeah, interesting. But do you find yourself, like, now that you're a mother raising 4 children, do you find yourself trying to compensate that by giving them a more steady environment, not moving houses as much?
100%, 120%. Yes, I do. I think part of the journey for me and for many of us is just being consciously aware of what our behaviours are. And so I'm very consciously aware of the fact that I've tried to break the cycle in the dysfunction of my family and you know, my mother and father growing up, and we can come to talk about my mum in a minute as well. But I have been very aware that I'm trying to, and I'm not trying too hard, but that I am endeavouring to give my children a stable upbringing. So perhaps for me, coming from quite an unstable upbringing, I need to be consciously aware of that. Whereas perhaps somebody who's come from a very stable family environment, it's just second nature. That is just the way that things are. But for me, yes, I've definitely tried 110% to make sure that my children are in a stable environment. I don't think that's the same as mollycoddling or being overprotective, because I still, you know, like them to be a bit free range and to, you know, understand life and to understand other people's experiences and to be creatives themselves. But I, of course, naturally, like any parent, I don't necessarily want my children to go through the same pain that I endured to become a creative. Not saying they have to be creatives. They could be, I could be a tiger mum. They could be lawyers and doctors if they want to. But I think the creative side is just, that's who I am. And so I guess that's what I know how to teach. So I paint with my children. We, write stories together. We can be mad scientists together. That's the way I know how to teach and impart values and knowledge as a parent, whereas other people might do that. Like my mum, for example, is a maths teacher. She sits down with my kids and does maths, and that's her way of sharing her values and imparting knowledge to them.
Yes. There are two beautiful comments here. Let me just read that. Mimi, you're a magnificent storyteller, and my parents are both World War II veterans. Your story has helped me consider my parents' experience and the grandparents and great-grandparents' influence on them and me. Both my parents immigrated to the US, and you helped my perspective on that. This is from Kitty Norris. And here's a question from Charlotte Elton. It says, now, directly following up on that, how did you come to gratitude and compassion, and how long did the process take?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you, Kitty, for your comment. That means so much to me to hear from a reader and how my book has affected you. So thank you. And then in answer to the question about forgiveness and gratitude, that is a fantastic question, because that is, I feel, what life is all about, and that has been the savior to my mental health and well-being. Because once I found forgiveness, so first of all, I had to track the story, and I wrote the book. At first, it was for myself. As I mentioned before, it was my own therapy around what was happening between my dad and me in court. And I'm actually really grateful that it came to a head and that he took me to court, because it did give me the opportunity to explore the family history. So there's all, it's all rainbows and silver lining in the end. But at the time, it was really hard going. And so in terms of how long it took to do that, well, as I mentioned, it took 5 years for me to write the book. And I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to write a book, but even to take 5 minutes just to think about your family history and the trajectory of events going back a couple of 100 years, if not further, to think about how culture has influenced just that microcosm of a relationship between you and your parent or you and your sibling, that in itself is worth doing, because what it does is it just opens our minds and hearts to seeing things from other points of view. And that's what reading does, of course. It creates empathy. So in terms of the forgiveness, I felt that I needed to excavate my family story quite deeply, in my case, to be able to find that forgiveness. And the more that I researched about the Japanese occupation in Hong Kong, the more that I researched about the White Australia policy in Australia and the sort of racism that my father must have encountered. And the more that I put together, the more that I tessellated the pieces of the puzzle together from things that I'd picked up as a child, or even throughout my adult years that my father had told me, or that my auntie had told me, or my other aunties had told me, all of those little threads of stories I managed to weave together to create this tapestry of what I imagined to be the family truth. And that really helped me find forgiveness with my father. Now, to get to the gratitude bit, which is even better than forgiveness, because I think what forgiveness does is forgiveness has with it this undercurrent of, okay, I'm the better person because I'm able to forgive. And in that also, that also speaks to this idea of superiority and inferiority. And that's not where I feel the best place is. That's where I sat for a while, just with forgiveness. And I just thought, I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing. But then when I got to the point of gratitude, that just lifted this whole other sort of, weight from my shoulders, because gratitude is so much better than forgiveness, because gratitude in itself just means, okay, I'm not only accepting of everything that has happened to me or to, the generations of my family. I'm actually grateful that all of those things have happened, because they have culminated in me becoming who I am today and being able to benefit from my story and from their stories. So having gratitude is a wonderful thing. And now with just even with little things, like, I don't know, somebody, let's just talk in a banal sense, somebody cutting you off in traffic on the road, like instead of just going, okay, I'm going to forgive them, they might be having a a bad day, I'll just try to skip forgiveness. And this takes a lot for some people's brains to get around, but I'll just try to skip forgiveness and go to gratitude. Thank you for doing that, because that kept me present. That's given me an opportunity to deal with my own maybe anger or frustration over your behavior. That's given me an opportunity to be introspective and think about, okay, how do I really want to behave in these sorts of situations of confrontation? So that can be with a stranger in the street, you know, a bad driver on the road. It can be with your own parent. It could be with your child, with your spouse. And I find even when I'm having an argument with my husband, which is frequently, you know, like any loving couple have arguments, yes, I try to think to myself, and this is only a result of having written House of Choir and only a result of going on this journey that I've been on with forgiveness towards my father, and that even in the moment when I'm having a discussion, an argument with my husband, I try to think in the back of my mind, thank you for disagreeing with me, to give me the opportunity to remain calm and to respond rather than react.
That is impressive. Okay, I cannot say when I come to a traffic light or someone cuts me off and I would say thank you. I think that will take a long time of practice to get there. Do you have any tips to share aside from the process of writing, which in some ways it almost sounded to me like therapeutic in a way that helped you to find forgiveness and gratitude? Do you have any daily practices? Like nowadays during pandemic, everyone's, you know, cooped up in the house, and then anything can light off angry comment from the kids. And what do you have any daily practice that you can share that?
Well, I do. So first of all, I always have with me, particularly when I'm doing an interview or if I'm feeling a bit out of sorts, I have this beautiful rose quartz crystal that that I have in my room. And I have a number of other crystals that I love to just sit with because of their, you know, supposedly therapeutic vibrational energy. They make me feel good. I like looking at them, and I just really enjoy having them around. So that's one sort of daily practice that I enjoy with my meditation. So I meditate. That's something that I've only discovered in the last, you know, 5 years or so since I started writing the book. I always knew about meditation. I tried to dabble in meditation. It's something that I just thought, oh, that just seems so hard. It seemed like something that I had to study and perfect because, you know, as you know from knowing a bit of my story, I am self-admittedly, you know, an overachiever. And I thought, well, if I'm not going to be able to do meditation right, I just don't want to do it. So I hadn't really looked at it before until I knew, you know, I broke down during this episode with my dad. And after my Aunty Theresa died, I broke down to break through. And part of that breaking through required that I took on daily practices such as meditation, such as sitting with my crystals, such as listening to healing podcasts. So one of the things that I've found a beacon of light and hope during the pandemic is listening to Oprah's interviews with Eckhart Tolle. So Eckhart Tolle, if you haven't already heard of him, is the author of A New Earth and The Power of Now. And his voice takes a bit of getting used to. I mean, I absolutely adore him, but, you know, some people that I recommend his podcast to just say, oh, I can't listen to him, he speaks too slowly. And I just say, well, just speed it up a little bit. But I just find his, you know, he is a spiritual healer, and the presence of mind that he has and the reminders that he gives to stay present and to know that in this moment, I mean, his main message is just that in this moment, as in during the pandemic, in lockdown, whatever your circumstance is, in this moment, you are okay. It is all right. And I think that bringing our minds back to presence is something that I've been working on for years now, and it's continual work. Like I will work on this for the rest of my life, and I just feel that, again, I just feel very lucky, and I'm filled with gratitude that, you know, there are books that we can read, there are podcasts like yours that we can listen to, there are things that we can do to elevate ourselves into a greater presence, but also to a higher level of consciousness, so that we can enjoy life with greater intensity than we even knew possible. And that's been my experience. I can't speak for everybody else, but I do know that my feeling is that I want everybody to feel as happy as I feel. And I want everybody to know that they can overcome family trauma and that they can overcome adversity. And I know that throughout my life, a lot of people, you know, may have, I've had people say it to me, that they think, oh, wow, Mimi Kwa's just swanned through life and what a dream career, and isn't she lucky? And I am lucky. I'm not saying that I'm not. But when people read my story, they understand that there was adversity there, and there have been challenges. And if you can come through challenges and still have a huge beaming smile on your face like I do, then I think that's that's a testament to life doing what it should be doing, and the miracles of life, the universe, God, whatever it is that you want to call it, working through us to create good things.
Yeah, that is beautiful, beautiful. Well said. Now, actually, Helen put in a comment here that's on this point as well. Perhaps love is the essence of forgiveness and gratitude, and requires such a great attitude, right, to be there. And now, following along some of these challenges, Michelle Kneeling has a great question here. Having brought up in WA, I'm not sure if this is Washington or Australia, I understood and was disturbed by the portrayal of racism that you and the people around you were subjected to growing up, right? Do you think things have improved there a little bit?
I think definitely. I think things across the Western world, across Australia, have been improved incredibly. There's still so much work to do, of course, and that work comes with being consciously aware of, how we treat people and how the media portrays people, and giving, equal airtime to different diverse, people from different diverse backgrounds. And that's all something that people in different areas of different sort of public industries, like the media, like television, like radio, newspapers, those visible industries are consciously working on, and I know that they are. I do know that things have improved just from, I don't live in Western Australia now, I'm in Melbourne, but I Australia, even though some people think Australia has lots of different countries because sometimes the different states behave that way, Australia as one nation, I can say my children are almost colorblind. They really don't, they see the person before they see the color, which is so wonderful. It's fantastic that they're not experiencing the same sort of racism and discrimination that that people like I have experienced in the past have done. So a lot of the racism, I think, that took place when I was a child, well, I'm sure probably all of it was due to ignorance. People would say to me, oh, they'd say something racist about Chinese people, oh, the chog, the smack, oh, whatever. And then they'd say, oh, but you're okay, Mimi. Well, hang on. What makes me different? And what that, with hindsight, and now that we're able, as adults, we can dissect that and go, well, hang on, the reason that they say, but you're okay, Mimi, it's because they knew me, because I was a personal friend. And so from that, we can take that any kind of racism or discrimination can be broken down when people connect on that personal level. And that can be between world leaders, let alone two children in the playground.
That is absolutely true. Now we deal with sort of China, and if people are just reading the New York Times and the headlines, and people go like, well, China now is so scary. But when I travel there, the people there are so warm and so sort of hospitable. It is the power of person-to-person connection that helps to break these barriers. You're absolutely, I'm with you 100%. And I want to ask a little bit about this huge difference of how people deal with their anxieties or mental health issues between China and the West, right? In China, almost traditionally, this is a stigma. We don't want to talk about it. Like if you go in to see a therapist, that's already like even more stigma. But is it different in Australia? I know in the States, it's absolutely normal to, seek professional help. And I know you're doing quite a bit working there. Tell us your experience in that.
Yeah, it's interesting how different societies and cultures evolve around any sort of stigma, including that around mental health. In Australia, I feel like we are following the United States and Canada perhaps in that area. I don't think we're quite there yet, in that we're just having conversation around the water cooler at work and just saying, oh, when I went to see my therapist during my lunch break, like we're not quite at that point, but I can see it going there. I know I, for one, am very open in talking about having gone to see a psychologist, around it was kind of around the inherited issues, because I was really going to speak about my relationship with my dad and my relationship with my mum. And it wasn't that I necessarily have, or I don't have any clinically diagnosed mental health issue. I don't have a condition, but it helped me to go into therapy to talk about my mum and my dad. I mean, my dad, you probably sort of pick up, he's not diagnosed as having any sort of mental health issues, but he definitely has some mental health issues that have never been addressed. And a lot of that is, as you say, because, culturally in Chinese culture, there's a huge stigma around that. And my mum, we haven't sort of mentioned yet, but my mum is a diagnosed chronic and acute schizophrenic. And so that really complicated, or, was an added challenge to the reality of my childhood as well, growing up with her and her delusions. There was a huge stigma around mental health when I was growing up, and so much so that even after my mum was misdiagnosed and given the wrong treatment, her condition was just swept under the carpet for decades. And it wasn't until she came to live with me here in Melbourne that my hand wasn't forced, but I just thought, I can't relive my childhood, and I can't have my children relive my childhood by growing up with an undiagnosed, untreated schizophrenic in the house with us. So when my mum came to live with me, I actually forced her to get help, and it's best thing that I could have done for her. And if there's ever any regret, I only wish that I had pressed her side of the family more strongly when I was younger to do something about it, because I did press, but it was like, banging my head up against a brick wall. And so the only way that I felt that I could deal with it at the time as sort of a teenager and then a young 20-something was to run away. And so, I moved from Perth to Melbourne, didn't really put it behind me, but tried to, and just having that distance while I forged ahead with my television career. And while I started a family, having that distance sort of, I guess, helped me shut it out. But as we all know, you can run, but the trauma or the sadness or the shame or the challenge will always find you, and it will always follow you until you deal with it. And so with my mum, with my dad, eventually I got to, grateful for this, I got to deal with it.
I actually don't think you should feel any regret for that. I mean, you had the most natural responses any normal human being. You were a teenager, you were not empowered to press more, right? And in fact, I think you and your mom were both very brave, very. And your dad, despite all his eccentricities, I find him adorable. Like the services at Mandarin Garden, he had electrical engineering to legal services to babysitting to marriage celebrant. What a character. Right? Okay, so yeah, I want to sort of probe a little bit on the writing process, right? It was such a sweeping story from 1900s to now, actually late 1890s. How do you decide on which story to include and which ones to exclude, to leave out?
That's another great question. I actually wrote about 70,000 words more than are in the book, and that can hopefully become another story. And that was not necessarily about the Quartz family. It was just I was writing, I started off writing about the Quartz family and the history, and then and that in itself, there were decisions to be made along the way of what to leave out. But I tried to look at the trajectory of what we know historically around the Japanese invasion, not only of Hong Kong, but also pockets along the border of China. And so in just sort of researching that history, that kind of gave me a map to work out what the family's trajectory was. And then in terms of how many characters to include, I mean, my mind boggles just looking at my family tree, and I'm sure yours does just hearing it.
Too.
So basically the family tree was in Chinese characters. So I had to get a friend, or a number of friends actually, in the end, to come over, Chinese friends in Melbourne, to come over and help me translate the family tree, and also my cousin, second cousin Matthew Kwa, who provided that to me. He was a help over email, but he wasn't here in Melbourne, so we couldn't meet up in person. And anyway, so yes, there were decisions to be made every step of the way. The 70,000 words down the track were at a point when, in my childhood, or when I get to my childhood in the story, I went off on a complete tangent talking about my mum's side of the family, because I think once my mum's mental health came up in the story, and what that was like growing up with somebody with a severe mental illness, that then took me off, on the path of my mum's upbringing and her father and her mother and her history. And there's a whole history there. My grandfather on my mum's side was MI5 during World War II, and he was liberating concentration camps. He was parachuting into enemy territory and rescuing British pilots who'd been shot down by the Nazis. So there were all of these stories that I wrote down that had to come out of the book, because that wasn't the Kwa story. And that in itself was a whole journey, and so interesting. And then in terms of the characters, I mean, there were so many characters in my childhood, so many uncles and aunts in my dad's childhood. I couldn't name them all. I could, because it just would have been too confusing for the reader, because it was confusing enough for me. So I decided I just needed to simplify it to be able to have a concise story and path that would really take the reader on a journey, so that it's enjoyable and entertaining and informative as well, without being too confusing.
That must be a painful decision to make, because those are fantastic stories, right? But you had to leave them out. And particularly some of the ancient, not ancient, I mean the older, the great-grandfather generation stories, aside from the written family tree, which you're lucky. My family's family tree was destroyed during Cultural Revolution, so I don't have any record of it. Aside from that, are there other written records, or were the stories oral history passed on? Did you interview your relatives to get all that?
Well, it's oral history passed on, and to be quite honest, in that first section of the story, because I wasn't alive, a lot of it had to just be based on historical research as to what life was like at the time. So I had the family tree, I had memories of stories that my auntie or aunties, plural, had told me. I had stories that my father had told me, some of which, knowing my dad, you have to take with a grain of salt. So all of these things I just tried to marry together to create a narrative that would be coherent both for myself and for the reader. So what was the weather like on that day? I don't know, but I wrote about it because I researched, you can do this on Google too. It's amazing. You can look up, weather on this day and this year, or if you can't find for that year because records don't go back that far, you sort of go, okay, well, maybe if I look at maybe I'm looking for what the weather would be like in 1898, but the furthest it goes back is 1968. So I just go for that weather, and then I take off a couple of degrees because of global warming. The way that an author's mind works.
I think it's perfectly reasonable, right? Did you have to travel there? The reason I ask this question is because we at WildChina, some of our clients contacted us. One of them, funny enough, his grandfather was a former silk stocking factory. Their family owned it. And so he contacted us and provided some historical documents, and we had to like call up the historian, call up the city. My team did the research, and eventually he got to see the same building and matched some of the old photographs, part of it, not all of it. China changes so fast, right? So we do this kind of research for adoptees, for World War II veterans and all of that. Did you have to do this kind of intelligence work to get there?
Mate, why did I not meet you 5 years ago? I would have been on a plane like that. Well, I wasn't able to do that level of intelligence work. I did write to some, different municipalities in China and different authorities to try to do my research. But as you know, with the language barrier, that was near impossible. And when I did get answers, and usually nobody got back to me, but when I did get answers, it was the records in that district or in that area were not digitized. They were still in writing, and it would be impossible for somebody to go and find them. So the message I was getting there is that if I really wanted to do the research as thoroughly as possible, I would have to get on a plane and go and probably film a documentary doing it to get to the bottom of everything absolutely 100% accurately. And I think because I had 4 children and running a household, running my career, I just wasn't able to realistically do that. So I just went on the research that I could do. However, I have spoken to a friend who is she's a producer and a writer, and she and I dream of going to China together one day and filming something, and maybe even, how sometimes you get these non-fiction works and then they go and they find something new, they go and research it to go and follow the trail, and then something new pops up that you just didn't know about. So I feel like that would be a dream, to be able to do that one day and follow the family path from Beijing down to Hong Kong and kind of walk in their shoes a little bit in the modern day, and to have a nice hotel to stay in along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. When the pandemic is over, right?
Of course.
So as we're almost out of time, I just want to ask one last question, because your ending of the book was so powerful. It says, I'm your father's line. I am not your friend. I am a direct descendant of the Emperor of China. I am 23rd generation Qua. And it was just, you have to read it in the context to sort of feel the power of it. So the last question is, what in your eyes is uniquely Qua, and what is representative of China, and what is actually commonalities across your Chinese family and Australian family? Yeah.
I think the uniqueness of all, and I guess this is a tautology because it's not really unique, across all Chinese families, is that we are all descendants of the dragon. And House of Qua is no different in that belief runs strong and true through the veins and in the blood of the Qua family. And I even have, since writing the book, I've had distant Qua cousins that I didn't know about who live in Australia who have reached out to me. Because you think about it, my dad had 32 brothers and sisters. So, we Quas are all over the place. And I've had people reach out to me, one in particular, a cousin who is a budding, she's young, I think she's 19, she's a budding fashion designer. And I posted on Instagram, she's designed this outfit, or it's a beautiful dress that has dragon scales kind of embedded around it on the silk. And she wrote to me and she said, oh, I designed that to just try to get in touch with my Chinese heritage, because she was born in Australia like me. And I think it's, you know, everybody's having different experiences across the Kwa family, but in my niche stream of Kwa, I would say that our ability to, and maybe this is in lots of families, although a lot of people tell me it's pretty unique in my family, our ability to forgive and to just get over momentous things like Supreme Court lawsuit battle and still be, and my dad still, and I don't want to, you know, I don't want to spoil the story, but I'm sure that you want to know how things are with my dad. And the main thing that he said about the book was, why didn't you include all the court cases that I won?
I have to say, like, that's my main takeaway is like, never let things get you down. Like your father's spirit is like, no matter how grim things looked, he always sees the bright side of things, right? So great. Well, we are truly out of time. I just want to thank you, Mimi, for chatting with us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us too. Any parting words of wisdom you want to share with us, Mimi?
Oh, I just love that you touched upon the topic of forgiveness and gratitude. And I think that my only words of wisdom would be that, you know, if anybody is kind of stuck in a difficult pattern of behavior with a loved one, that can change. Like, it is possible. And there are some relationships where I thought this will always be like this, and it actually doesn't have to be, because we change as people, we evolve and we blossom and bloom, and we ascend to the next level of our development. And as we sort of expand as individuals, that also contributes to us expanding as the human race and as people on this planet. So I think if we focus on our core individual relationships, that has a ripple effect out to everything else.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And please, if you're on Instagram, follow Mimi and you'll get updates on, you know, her maybe next book that she's working on. It's Mimi_Kwa, KWA. And thanks again. And next month, please come back and join us. We will have a lighter fare. We'll read about Dim Sum Field Guide by Caroline Phillips. And I do have a podcast. It is the China Travel Podcast at WildChina website, also on all streaming platforms. Thank you for taking the time. And thanks again, Mimi. And thank you for sharing all the wisdom.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.